Hi everyone, my name's Iona and I'm going to be moderating the webinar today. So first thing I want to do is say a massive welcome to everybody. This event is called Understanding Mutual and Situational Abuse. It's part of 16 days of action to end gender-based violence. Kent Integrated Domestic Abuse Service are hosting 16 events, culminating this Thursday, to inform, educate and inspire action so that we can make domestic abuse everybody's business. Because domestic abuse is everybody's business and everyone can make a difference, which is just what you're doing today by attending. So thank you. During the event, you're able to use the Q&A function on your screen to ask questions for Damian. As moderator, I'll publish these throughout the event and I'll ask them at the end of the session. You can use the thumbs up, which is just underneath the questions once they're published, to upvote the question if that's something you'd like to ask as well. And if you want to ask a follow-up question, use the words follow-up to preface that question, and I'll do my very best to link them together. Damian's going to be speaking for approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for questions. I just wanted to let you know that the email confirmations show the webinar as slightly longer so that we don't get cut off by the system. My last bit of housekeeping is to let you know that the new and improved domestic abuse website is probably popped up on your screen, and you can use this to find out about your local services. If you don't want to be seeing that right now, you can just press the little X in the corner of that pop-up and it'll pop down for you. So that just leaves me with the wonderful job of introducing Damian. Damian McCann is a couple psychoanalytic psychotherapist working as head of learning and development at Tavistock Relationships, and an adjunct faculty member of the International Psychotherapy Institute in Washington, DC. He's also a consultant systemic psychotherapist and has many years of experience working with children, adolescents and their families, and of supervising a range of professionals both individually and in groups. He has a particular interest in working with gender and sexual diversity in psychoanalytic practice and has published and taught widely on this topic. His doctoral research was concerned with understanding the meaning and impact of violence in the couple relationships of gay men. He's currently editing a book, Same-Sex Couples and Other Identities, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, to be published by Routledge in 2021. And we are extremely pleased to have his expertise with us today.
Okay, so I'm just sorry that I'm just taking you back because the slides started on. Right, okay. So I'm speaking to you today because of my interest and experience in working with domestic violence and abuse over many years. As Iona said, my clinical doctorate was concerned with understanding and working with violence and abuse in the couple relationships of gay men. And this is still an under-researched area, same-sex violence and abuse. As a consultant family and systemic psychotherapist working for the NHS, I sat for a number of years on the MARAG, so I completely understand the seriousness and dangers of domestic abuse for partners and their children. Indeed, in a recent Observer article, we learn that the first Commissioner for Domestic Abuse for England and Wales, Nicole Jacobs, is committed to working closely with the campaign to tackle femicide. Between 2009 and 2018, one woman died on average every 3 days, 20 men killed twice, and the rate of killing has remained unchanged over a decade, in spite of increased awareness, investment in police training, and changes in the law. I'm also aware that I'm speaking to you at a time of increased concern relating to the serious rise in the incidence of domestic abuse during the pandemic and the urgent need to reach victims in order to prevent further harm and death. So I appreciate, against this backdrop, a presentation on the concept of mutual abuse and situational couple violence may at best feel misplaced, and at worst may be something that feels a bit of an outrage. So I'm now going to speak to the different elements in this first slide. So given the nature of the problem, it's not at all surprising that there has been heightened sensitivity within the field as to the most effective ways of intervening in these relationships to manage the risks, ensure safety, and obtain positive outcomes. Yet the push to view domestic violence and abuse purely in terms of a victim and perpetrator divide leaves little room or appetite for adopting a relational perspective on a phenomenon that could ultimately allow practitioners to offer a greater range of treatment options in the service of assisting these couples overcome their adversity. Virginia Goldner believes that those holding a feminist position have tended to minimize the emotional complexity of abusive relationships, and she suggests that the field has been burdened by ideological divisions, which have kept ideas in separate camps. Although the accepted wisdom and practice of separating couples along victim and perpetrator lines and offering targeted interventions to the individuals within these relationships forms a key element in the repertoire of treatment options, Farmer and Callan suggest that it is limited in that it provides only a partial understanding of the phenomenon of violence and abuse within couple relationships. For that reason, there has been a growing interest in couple-based interventions, and a recent overview of services for intimate partner violence in Finland, whilst recognizing the controversy in offering couple therapy, emphasized the benefits of working with partners together. That was a meta-research in 2018. Furthermore, there are many accounts of practitioners within the field, both in this country, the US, and Canada, working safely and effectively with such couples to help them tackle the violence and address important underlying factors that perpetuate the violence whilst ensuring the continuation of the couple relationships. It has also been suggested that couples therapy has a positive impact in decreasing recidivism, and in some instances is the better treatment option over more standard approaches. And that's Kaka-Kurt et al. Research done in 2016. Nevertheless, the understandable concerns about safety, together with the fears of victim blaming and the idea of increasing the risk of violence through an intensification of emotions during couple therapy, raises obvious questions concerning its appropriateness and effectiveness for those offering conjoint work. On the other hand, separating couples is also not without its concerns. For instance, the Ofsted multi-agency response to children living with domestic violence specifically highlights a flaw in the thinking. Although it is suggested that putting an end to abusive relationships by splitting the couple reduces the risk, research also shows that doing so has the potential to increase the risk. This is because of failure to fully appreciate the dynamic workings of these relationships, together with the couple's own attachment system, leaves practitioners at the mercy of couples who, despite efforts to separate them, meet with a determination in the couples themselves to remain together. Furthermore, individuals within couple relationships may not necessarily recognize or define themselves in victim and perpetrator forms. They may not actually see that that's part of their own definition. Moreover, offering separate interventions to couples also has the potential to increase the level of disturbance for a partner who feels excluded. For instance, heightened paranoia, leading to more controlling behavior, which then becomes a serious problem for couples that continue to live together. Although obviously not an argument for holding such couples together, it nevertheless reminds us of the need to think carefully about the effects of splitting couples when they continue to live under the same roof. A final consideration in offering separate interventions to couples in which there is violence and abuse is that of deciding whether and when the individual interventions are felt to have reached a stage where a couple-based intervention may be considered necessary and appropriate. Since without this bit of thinking, how are we to know whether the individual-based interventions have actually been effective in helping partners manage their problematic couple dynamics? Okay, I'm now going to move on to looking at the nature of violence and abuse in couple relationships. A key consideration, and one that is fundamental to the development of new approaches within the field, and which honors the nature and complexity of violence and abuse within relationships, is the recognition that not all violence is the same. Kelly and Johnson, for instance, draw important distinctions between violence and abuse within couple relationships that contain elements of coercion and control from that which is defined as situational couple violence. The prevailing view that domestic abuse is primarily conducted by men against women and driven by men's power and the desire to control their partners denotes a particular type of violence which Kelly and Johnson refer to as coercive controlling violence. This involves one partner abusively controlling the other through isolation, threats of harm, or actual violence. The violence is often frequent, severe, and takes a variety of forms. Interestingly, according to Kelly and Johnson, coercive controlling violence is usually present in only 11% of cases. In situational couple violence, the violence and abuse often involve both partners reacting to particular strains within their relationship, where the flare-ups do not necessarily escalate or involve serious or life-threatening injuries, and where fear and control is not the primary mechanism driving and directing the relationship. As Tunis Alves and De Stefano in 2014 point out, in many couples, violence is not a means to control, but rather, as research shows, an ineffective strategy for trying to deal with personal and interpersonal issues. Yet a continual tension within my work with couples presenting with high conflict and abuse in their relationships concerns the question of whether the difference between situational and coercive controlling violence is indeed a real or a false distinction. Refining the question still further, are we in danger if we embrace the notion of situational couple violence, of turning our backs on the key principles of gender, power, and control that continue to exert such a powerful and organizing influence within the field? This is even more pressing, given that Kelly and Johnson basically say that situational couple violence is not a static category, and there are instances where the abuse can and does actually escalate to dangerous levels. Therefore, even when the decision is made to work with couples exhibiting this form of violence, the abuse must be kept under review, and the therapist must be willing to stop the therapy when the risk increases or where coercive controlling elements enter the work. Also included in Kelly and Johnson's typology are two different categories that are considered important, especially since they throw light on the question of mutual couple violence and abuse. The first of these is violent resistance, which speaks to a victim's despair and need to stop the violence against them by lashing out or responding with verbal threats and abuse of their own. However, this needs careful assessment, since although it masquerades as mutual couple violence, it's anything but mutual. And for those of you who watched the recent BBC programme entitled "Is This Coercive and Controlling?", will know only too well how the two individual partners contributed to a somewhat confusing couple dynamic that had the audience struggling to define the nature of the abusive relationship. This confusion is further compounded by the continued reliance on the physical aspects of violence and the diminution of emotional and psychological presentations of abuse. There has also been talk of another of Johnson's categories, i.e. mutual violent control, where both partners use violence to control the other. If indeed this does exist, we must seek to understand the conditions that prevail within the couple relationship that give rise to such abuse. Otherwise, we may be in danger of overlooking the potential for coercion and control by one partner towards the other, which would then give rise to the definition of violent resistance rather than mutual violent control. Furthermore, when responding to same-sex couple violence, the gender and power dynamics that seem to operate so clearly within heterosexual couple relationships appear much more confused, possibly linked to the discomfort of the identification of men as victims and women as perpetrators. So as you can see, this is an area which is fraught with complexity and where different ideas and schools of thought prevail. So I'm now going to introduce you to the application of a relational approach to domestic couple violence and abuse. So in 2008, I began my training at Tavistock Relationships, then called the Tavistock Centre for Couple Relationships, qualifying in 2012 as a psychoanalytic couple psychotherapist. The importance of this for today's presentation is that one of the central tenets of this particular training is the idea that the couple is the patient or the client, or more precisely, according to Stan Wojcinski, the interaction between the partners is the patient or the client. And this is further captured in Mary Morgan's reference to the importance of the therapist holding what she refers to as a couple state of mind. Both concepts essentially promote the centrality of the couple relationship as the object of interest and attention, whilst at the same time also cautioning against the dangers of focusing too much on individual partners at the expense of the couple relationship itself. However, given the dangers of working with couples where domestic abuse is a factor and focusing primarily on the couple and their dynamics, relational therapists are obviously presented with a host of technical challenges, especially since the dominant discourse within the field, as we know, is one that advocates individual-based approaches for the treatment of domestic abuse with couple relationships. However, given that in a survey conducted at Tavistock Relationships in 2014, of the 221 couples being seen for therapy together during the week we issued the questionnaire, we find that 44% of the therapists seeing these couples reported some level of abuse. And because of this, we felt we needed to ensure that the approach we were offering was both ethically appropriate and effective in addressing the abusive dynamics. Indeed, our experience of assessing and working with these couples, presenting over many years, has allowed us to develop ways of working that increase the opportunity for couples to think about what is happening to them within their relationship and to make the necessary adjustments in their relational dynamics to reduce the incidence of abuse. Further refinement of the model incorporating mentalization-based techniques alongside interagency working, where appropriate, provides a framework for working with these couples safely. Moreover, we only ever accept couples who fall within the category of situational couple abuse, and when we encounter elements of coercion and control in the work, either at assessment or in the ongoing therapy, we take immediate steps to direct these couples away from our setting and towards more appropriate domestic abuse services within the community, which are better equipped to address the specific issues of risk and safety related to the more extreme end of violence and abuse. When considering situational couple violence and abuse, it is suggested that one of the challenges for these couples is their inability to contain feelings. Unsurprisingly, therefore, it is often the case that where there has been a failure of containment in their earlier lives, this increases the likelihood of these feelings being acted out in ways that may become abusive. Here I'm thinking specifically about dysregulated, hyper-aroused couples who exhibit limitations in their capacity to think. These are couples who continually interrupt each other, who shout over the top of each other, and who show little or no capacity for curiosity, empathy, or understanding. It has also been suggested that the type of attachment patterns partners have experienced growing up becomes an important contributory factor in understanding the nature of the abuse within the couple relationships. Bartholomew and colleagues, who are Canadian researchers, for instance, suggest that particular forms of insecure attachment put individuals at risk of becoming involved in and having difficulty leaving problematic and abusive relationships. Take, for example, the pairing of an insecure, anxious, and preoccupied partner with an insecure, avoidant partner. That often results in something akin to an advance and retreat dynamic, which, when activated, may lead to abusive exchanges, as one partner, in an effort to get through to the other, intrudes on them, and the partner who feels intruded upon forcibly rejects or retreats, leaving the other partner feeling frustrated and angry. Efforts to help such partners engage with each other's vulnerabilities within the context of couples therapy often intensifies the dynamic between them and results in protests and a rise in expressed emotion. This is why we employ mentalization-based techniques as a means of trying to contain such couples and to create the space for both of them to speak about their upset and distress rather than to act it out. Judith Pickering observes that couples often present for therapy precisely because the couple relationship has failed to contain the partners. Additional mechanisms that throw further light on the emergence of abusive dynamics within couple relationships center on the notion of the couple fit, projective processes that operate between couples, and the tendency to act out feelings rather than to think them through. Psychoanalytic couple therapists believe that couples show a propensity for carrying unwanted feelings for one another and to see those feelings reflected in others, which forms part of what we refer to as the unconscious couple fit. Take, for example, Linda, whose father was often absent during her childhood and whose mother had outbursts of anger and frustration. Linda partners with Tony, who grew up with a mother who was critical and demanding, and a father who was apparently long-suffering. Linda was drawn to Tony's strength and independence, and Tony was drawn to Linda's warmth and affection. Things go well until the birth of their daughter, when Linda starts to express anger and frustration at Tony's lack of involvement with her and their daughter. Tony reacts to Linda's criticism by blaming her for driving him away and lets it be known that he's not inclined to become more involved while she attacks him all the time. This escalating dynamic represents an unconscious enactment of an internalized parental couple relationship that is then brought to life between the partners and which has the potential to propel them towards ever-increasing cycles of conflict and possible abusive exchanges as they attempt to manage the problematic dynamic that has come to define their relationship. Helping such couples to, for instance, understand the shared anxiety that is often part of the transition to parenthood offers them a different reading of their situation, which in turn has the potential to help them de-escalate their cycle of conflict and to use each other more as a resource than recreating the very dynamics that are all too familiar to them whilst growing up with parents who could not turn to each other for nurturance and support. We also know that couples within relationships project unwanted feelings or aspects of themselves into the other, and this provides another potential for abuse as they become polarized and split. Tony, for instance, may have decided that he would not become the long-suffering father that his own father appears to have been, and that he would also keep distance from his critical and angry mother. Linda, who wants and needs a strong and involved father for their daughter, is faced with deep frustration and anger when Tony pulls away. And she then finds herself becoming a critical and angry mother, which reinforces Tony's need to get away. Linda, in this scenario, is also rendered helpless, and it is as if she has handed her own agency over to Tony as he rejects vulnerability and need. By providing a container for both partners to begin to think about and express what is happening to them, they come to better understand the nature of the split that is producing the conflict and it threatens the positive aspects of their connection. Tony can see that he's worried about becoming ineffective, and so he fights to assert himself, leaving Linda vulnerable and exposed. By helping her to express her upset with Tony's abandonment of her and their daughter, rather than critically attacking him for this, Tony begins to admit that he's very frightened of being taken over by the needs of his wife and daughter, and admits to turning away to avoid contact with his own vulnerability and anxiety. This acknowledgement and recognition helps the couple find a new connection in the face of moving from a twosome to a threesome. However, we can only really know whether it is safe to undertake this work with couples if we have conducted a good enough assessment. Above all, the assessor must seek clarity concerning possible risks. So the use of diagnostic measures, such as the clinical outcomes routine evaluation, which is the core, provides the assessor with important information about risks. However, it's also worth noting that according to Hiru in 2007, clients are more likely to report abuse on a questionnaire than through direct questioning. And we are also aware that couples may downplay the extent of the violence and abuse within their relationships, fearing the involvement of outside agencies such as the police, social care, etc. The rule of thumb is that if the assessor is not confident that they can recommend couples therapy for a couple in which there is the presence of abuse, then they need to conduct an extended assessment to see whether they are able to gain a more comprehensive understanding of the nature of the abuse and the capacity for change through conjoint work. In addition, we must also consider whether or when to meet partners separately rather than together. And we can talk about this later in the questions perhaps, but we've done a range of project work with different organizations, including Harrow Social Care, who approached us to ask if we could work with some of their couples whose children were on the child protection register because of instances of violence and abuse, and who were unable to remove from the register even after the individual treatments, because they just weren't sure that the couple relationship itself was actually in a better form, so that it wouldn't put the kids at further risk. And we've also been involved in high conflict, working with high conflicting couples. And in both of these projects, we would start the assessment with an individual meeting, usually with the female partner first, and then with the male partner, assuming they were a heterosexual couple. And only after those two individual meetings would we then do the third meeting. And only after that meeting would we consider whether it was actually appropriate or not to take these couples into therapy. Doing it this way allows the assessor to pick up elements of fear in one or both partners, as well as an opportunity to see how the individuals and couple have managed the consultation before deciding if it is indeed appropriate to undertake couple therapy. And I'm very aware of this because when I worked in CAMS and I was referred a family by the social worker in the community, in between the first meeting with the couple and the second meeting with the couple, the wife was sitting with a bruise on her face. And obviously I became very, very concerned about what I was seeing and asked if I could spend a bit of time with each of them separately. And it was pretty clear that in that instance, the wife had been happy to talk in the first meeting, and then the husband had attacked her after the session. So I'm very aware of the risks and the dangers in this whole area of thinking about offering couple therapy. A key criteria in agreements to participate in couple therapy where abuse exists and is known about, and which falls within the definition of situational couple violence, is the principle that there must be an undertaking that both partners wish for and are committed to living together safely. And that is Arlene Vetera and Jan Cooper writing about their Safer Families project, which they conducted in Reading in the early 2000s, and where they had a very particular model of responsibility, collaboration, and risk management. So where this is not the case, then it would not be appropriate to offer a couple intervention. So in the final slide, I'm just basically going to look at the considerations in advocating couple therapy in the presence of abuse. Stith et al. In 2005 believed that the violence has to be low to moderate if couple treatment is considered, and both partners should voluntarily agree to participate in conjoint therapy and have a commitment to remaining together. Further refinement of these criteria extend to the importance of both partners sharing similar views about the nature and incidence of violence, which may offer some protection against attempts to minimize the abuse or to diminish responsibility for it. The application of mentalization-based approaches to working with domestically violent couples seems an entirely appropriate and helpful way of managing the problematic dynamics that operate within these relationships. For instance, Peter Fonagy and Mary Target observe that violence is often the product of a person's lack of a capacity for reflection or mentalization. Mentalization-based techniques are therefore designed to create an increased capacity to manage affective states, precisely in order to allow for deeper exploration of the underlying issues that often result in the problematic abusive dynamics. The aim of such therapy is to create the conditions for the individuals to understand the nature of their relationship and to see whether they can be helped to contain and nurture the relationship for the benefit of themselves and their children. In a recent commentary on a chapter on working with domestic violence, I suggested that although the benefits of offering a couple therapy intervention in the field of domestic violence is gathering momentum, until we have a more secure evidence base supporting such intervention, it will no doubt continue to be frowned upon by those firmly wedded to the victim-perpetrator divide. Thank you.
Thank you, Damian. Absolutely fascinating. And I think that's absolutely coming through in these questions as well, because you might have seen we've got a fair few questions coming through. I think the first one I'm going to ask is just one from, I think, the first slide, and it's about that figure, about that 11% having that coercive controlling behaviour, and whether that's in terms of physically violent acts or whether that's in terms of threats as well. And then maybe linking that question to Steph's question, which is about whether the couples seen at Marek and other DA agencies and whether they're disproportionately showing coercive controlling abuse. So are there many couples maybe that are not in the mutual and situational category that are not seen by services? What proportion of couples seen at Marek would be seen as situational mutual, and what proportion might be suitable for couples therapy? So that's sort of 11% what we're looking at there, and then are we seeing the disproportionate numbers?
Yeah, I mean, Michael Johnson, who wrote the paper with Kelly, with, I think it's, I'm not sure, it might be Lorraine Kelly, but I can't remember. He's a sociologist, and he was using basically statistics issued by the different domestic abuse agencies in the States. And he basically was looking at coercive controlling violence in its multiple forms. I don't think it was just physical violence. I think he was looking at the more, but he was looking at the more extreme end. He was defining coercive controlling as escalating, as not mutual in any sense of the word. And basically, those are the couples that I'm very familiar with in the Marek. And having sat on the Marek for about 10 years, I think, there was a very, very small proportion of those couples where I was advocating a kind of couple-based intervention. Most of them fell very clearly into the victim and the perpetrator divide, and with high risks and real concerns for the women and the children. Some of them, occasionally, we would get some that were a little bit confusing. You weren't really sure whether whether it was more mutual, or at least that both partners had some equal contribution to make to the dynamic. But nevertheless, you know, when you joined all the information up, which is what the main value of the Marek and the beauty of the Marek, with all those multi-agencies around the table, something which looked one way at initial presentation, you would suddenly realize from other pieces of information being offered that actually it was anything but what it looked like in the first instance. And I think that always stays with me, because I don't know that we can really ever rest easily in this field, particularly working with couples, because, you know, there have been situations where I've heard of situations where individuals in those couples have come back at some later stage and basically complained that the therapist hadn't taken enough notice or taken seriously the coercive controlling elements. So I'm very acutely aware of that. Yeah. Does that sort of answer that question? Yeah.
Absolutely, I think so. And I think one of the things I was thinking about when you were speaking is really how in the infancy this field is. You know, even in terms of domestic abuse services, with the first refuge, you know, being opened in 1974, that's not an awful long time to be developing responses to domestic abuse. So there's an awful lot of learning to be done and exploring.
Yeah.
So Rebecca has asked what tools can be used to identify which type of abuse you're working with, and therefore what the best intervention might be.
Okay, so in the Harrow project, because we did it slightly differently than we do at Tavistock Relationships base, where we mainly see the couples together, because we were already aware that we were working with potentially abusive couples, we would essentially meet, as I said towards the end of the presentation, we would meet with each of the partners individually. And although we wouldn't be going through the MASH or the DASH report, we would still be asking those sorts of questions. Well, I would be anyway, in terms of whether there's any fear within the relationship, how bad does it get, who do they feel is responsible for the fights that occur. We would also be, I've noticed that there's questions about drugs and alcohol. We would also be asking very specifically about the circumstances in which the incidents of abuse occur. I would be looking for patterns, the emergence of patterns. And often you would find, well, not often, but sometimes you would find that every weekend there were one or two instances, and then you would ask about what was different about the weekends and during the week, and then you would find that they had the drugs and alcohol had a bigger profile. Also, third parties might be coming in and out, and that might increase issues around jealousy or, people forming other relationships, which might threaten the couple relationship. So all the time I would be, the only thing we really have in our work is a mind to think. And if we are being shut down, so we would talk about what we call the transference and the counter-transference. So the transference would be, let's say you get a very defensive couple who are aware that things are really bad in their relationship, but they don't want to take responsibility. They don't want to look at it. They want to carry on. But other people around them, other agencies are saying this can't continue. Immediately, your position, they transfer onto you the idea that you're against them. You're going to try and split them up. You're going to hurt them in some way. And so they might then start to join forces and push the therapist back. So in our countertransference, we would also be feeling some of the anxiety maybe, or some of the hostility. You might even find that they become abusive to you. I've had couples or individuals in couples who've not only just got angry with me, but also threatened and started shouting abuse at me. And, and I've had other situations where I've been really frightened to ask any questions and mindful of the fact that this couple have children. You then start thinking, well, this is obviously not something we can work with very safely here or very easily, because they're in such a state of defensiveness. And you would then start thinking the fear is obviously the thing that's controlling, maybe even controlling both partners. But you'd find out who's the most frightened in this relationship, and it may well be the kids. Yeah.
So there's been a follow-up question from Kaylee, so asking whether you'd be asking those questions about fear and responsibility for actions of both the partners, like in front of one another, or whether that would be sort of reserved for the private one-to-one discussions.
That's a really good question. It's a brilliant question, because when the couples come, let me just explain. So we're talking essentially in our normal service, couples booking online. So we have no control over who books and who turns up. And before they come into the room, they're asked to come early because we're doing it online. They're sent the forms in advance. And then the therapist or the assessor who's going to meet with them will get the forms and is able to have a look at them. And so you can start to see whether they've ticked the box about feeling intimidated, or whether they've intimidated other people, whether they've had violent whether there's been violent incidences, whether the risk concerning mental health and suicidality, etc., self-harm. And they fill these out separately. So, of course, when we meet with the couples, I would normally say to them, I know you fill these forms out separately, but they're in the service of thinking about your couple relationship. Is it okay if we talk about what you've both ticked on the forms? And so I try and make it as open and transparent as possible. Now, obviously, I hold the forms to the very end, till I've got to know the couple, till I've had the session, so that I can see what's coming up, whether I'm picking up, fear, whether I'm feeling very anxious and shut down. In which case, then I probably wouldn't take them up with them in the room together. I would say to them that we would like to think about the meeting today, and that I will be in touch with them. And then I might basically ring each of them individually to ask about the risks, so that I can see whether there is anything more to be said that they haven't basically wanted to say in front of the other because of the fear. So we wouldn't do that in all cases, but I think in cases where there is potential abuse or there is actual abuse, I would certainly do that for the safety, because we would be thinking not just couple, we would be thinking victim and perpetrator along, because that's what we're trying to tease out here. We can't work, if we work with coercive controlling couples or coercive controlling behavior in couple relationships, it's dangerous. We can't do it. Just won't do it. It's not ethical, and it's not safe.
So it's really about trying to unpick that, and you'll get that feeling in the room as to whether it feels appropriate to bring it up.
Yeah.
Whether you're thinking, actually, let's leave this at the door. Yeah.
Just in terms of, so let's say we take people into therapy because it looks fine, and then halfway through the therapy, so you've got the couple and you're starting to, you've picked up bits of annoyance between the couple, or you've seen things starting to get worse over a period of 1 or 2 weeks, because they would come for weekly sessions. I would then be thinking, what's going on here, and whether it's unidirectional, whether it's coming directly from one to the other, and obviously then a pattern's emerging. But it's often the case that they will be both feeling agitated and anxious and upset and angry. They might express it differently, but it's happening between them rather than just in one direction.
So we've got a question from Amy saying, is there anything that we as professionals can do with perpetrators or victims regarding attachment theory? Are there any tools that would be useful?
Well, I mean, we've got the adult attachment interview, which is not something I've ever used, but it essentially, so it's administered to individuals, adult individuals, and it picks up both in the questions and the responses to the questions what kind of insecurity within the attachment model exists, and whether you've got a preoccupied, anxious individual, whether you've got an avoidant, or whether you've got something more serious, which is disorganized attachment. And all of that gives you information about, it gives you a profile, if you like, of the couples. And then you start to work out whether you can offer something that is containing, that you become a secure base. And I think a lot of the perpetrator groups become a secure base for these men, mainly men, to come and understand something about their anger. And what they may come to understand is that actually it is linked to, it's like a child's response to, if they don't get what they want, they start screaming and shouting and flailing around. So you can get very primitive protest type behavior, which you get in very small kids. So you can certainly be thinking about these presentations and understand that some of the ways in which people are communicating is linked to very early attachment styles. And you can draw, I will usually say to people, look, I'm seeing someone very small in front of me at the minute. when you start to do that. I'm not seeing two, I'm seeing somebody like a little boy, a very hurt little boy, or a very upset, frightened little girl. Can we think about this? And they will start to recall sort of memories. They start, and the more, what we're trying to do is to increase the understanding, because if you've got more understanding of something, you don't just lash out. You have more to work with. You have more you just got more inside you to play with, and more tolerance. That's really what the mentalization stuff. Were there any questions? Because I'm assuming everybody knew what mentalization was. Do I need to just explain it in any way?
I think that would be really useful. Yeah, that's all right.
Normally, psychoanalytic therapists sit back and allow things to happen before them, and they will then ask questions or make interpretations. With the kinds of couples I was talking about, that either at assessment or that we've accepted into treatment, those sorts of couples who are argumentative, who never agree with each other, who start waving their fingers, who start shouting over the top of each other. These are couples who get very revved up and have very little capacity to mentalize. Mentalizing is basically to think. All they're doing is reacting. They're in a highly reactive state. The mentalization-based techniques are very active. So the therapist doesn't sit back. The therapist basically becomes very active, a bit like a parent or a teacher in the school, basically saying, hold it, I know you've got plenty. Just let me ask your wife first. I want to hear what she has. No, don't interrupt her. Keep, and this is all information as well, because how they manage being shut up or interrupted gives you more information about how this might be for them at home. And obviously I'm not one of the partners, so they might be a little bit more amenable. But eventually you create the space for them, and if they start to race off, you say, slow down, hang on, I'm getting lost, I'm getting confused, just a minute. When you say that, what do you mean? What do you think about what's just happened? No, don't interrupt, that. So you're using yourself in a very different way. It's exhausting, and it's a bit like what Super Nanny does when she keeps interrupting and trying to break the pattern. But you are actually trying to get them to think a little bit more, because the more calm they are, the more they're able to hear each other.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So it's about sort of giving a bit of time and space and thinking through the reactions and the possible reactions.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. So that might answer Alison's questions about thinking about which therapeutic models you would use for couples presenting with these issues, and maybe also link into Chloe's about how much does someone's childhood take accountability for this?
A lot. A hell of a lot. Not, but it doesn't have to just be childhood, because of course if you've been someone who had secure attachment, and then the love of your life goes off with your best friend, that might be enough of a kind of trigger to make people very suspicious, intolerant, very anxious and graspy. And that wouldn't necessarily have come out of a childhood. It's a situation that's happened late, more recently. But yeah, a lot of the disturbance, if you like, in couple relationships, you can trace it back. You can trace it back to what's been internalized by the two individuals in the couple. So what were they exposed to as a model of couple relationship? So basically, did they have parents who modeled some sort of capacity to work together, to think together, to sort out this? We're not saying people shouldn't have arguments or disagreements. It's about the way these are managed, I think. So if you've grown up in a family where the parents drank a lot and argued a lot, and there was a lot of plate throwing and a lot of lashing out, or you've grown up in a family where one of the partners was beaten on a regular basis, or where the couples just endlessly argued and never agreed, then you've internalized a pretty poor model of a couple relationship. So when you get into your own relationship, even though you might have a fantasy that it's going to be nothing like that, you'll find that it just comes to life between the two partners magically.
So those skills and those tools for managing conflict in a sort of healthier way haven't been built up and modelled.
Yeah, exactly. In terms of the therapeutic, the different therapeutic approaches, I mean, some couples want strategies. They want homework. They want behavioral strategies. They want to be told what to do. They want a very particular type of, almost a kind of cognitive behavioral model of couple therapy, or they want a more emotionally focused therapy, which is another model of it, where they're really sat down and made to look at each other and made to, so one person will say something and then they tell them to stop, and they basically ask the other person, what have you just heard? What do you think it means? So I don't think you can use that approach if you've got people who are rushing around inside themselves. You have to contain them first. So most of the therapies that we offer to couples, the emphasis is on providing a container that is going to be robust enough to contain them in the therapy and to allow them to feel their connection. So that because if you think about it, they're only with you for 1 hour, and then they go home for the rest of the week. You're relying on this couple's ego strength to hold them, and for them to be able to make use of what has happened in the room. If they just disintegrate after they leave the session, and we have had couples, that you can see them leaving the building, screaming and shouting at each other, and you just think, oh my God. And with those sorts of couples, you would have safety plans. So we would also basically talk couples through what to do if a crisis arises between sessions, so that they're not left just floundering. And one of the things might be to contact the police or to contact the local domestic abuse agencies, or to contact us if we're around. But yeah, but it takes a while. We're not talking about 1 or 2 sessions. Some of these couples come for maybe a year or two. So these are normally long-term treatments. We've been using time-limited treatments, certainly in the Harrow project, and also we did 2 lots of the Harrow project, and we've been doing the Reducing Parental Conflict projects. They're still ongoing, and those are time-limited treatments. So that's the other way of making sure more people get access to what we have to offer.
Mm-hmm. So I've got a question from Katie, or at least an idea that I might ask you just to speak to a little bit, because I know it's conversations that we've had in the past, is around the controversy of sort of a couple's approach when we're talking about domestic abuse, and maybe the sort of developing those understandings around different typologies of violence and how that sits for you guys.
Well, it sits well for me, and I think for most of the people that we train and work with at the Tavistock Relationships, it does not sit well between us and outside agencies. And I'm always aware of my gender, because, of course, the way in which men have kind of not taken responsibility and, tried to blame victims. So I was very aware of that at the Marek. Whenever I said something, I needed to be careful that I wasn't just, throwing out a line without any careful thought. But I have had situations where I was asked not to be on a panel because the IDVAs of that particular borough were absolutely outraged to have someone who believes in situational couple violence talk about it. And I understand that. I really appreciate that. We've also had situations where we've been working with the couple, and outside in the waiting area was the IDVA waiting to meet with the female partner, because she was doing a victim support program with the female, and we were doing a couple therapy with the male and the female, and that just brought to life, really, or brought to life the division, the different ideologies that operate. So we just have to. My belief is that we just have to keep talking around these different perspectives. I have had IDVIST really question me, saying your assessments are obviously not good enough. Otherwise, if they were, you would find the victim eventually. You're not looking hard enough. And that sits uncomfortably for me anyway. But I'm also aware that we have worked with many, many couples who've benefited, and that the Harrow project, the feedback and the evaluation was pretty good. A lot of those kids did actually, couples were very grateful to have strategies for managing their conflict. The kids were able to come off the child protection register or be downgraded to child in need. And the police call-outs completely disappeared, because one of the measures was the number of police call-outs, and they just stopped. Mm-hmm. So I think there are certain couples you can work with very effectively.
Yeah. And I suppose it's, you were talking earlier about that sort of capacity for change and the sort of commitment to living in a really safe way. And it's sort of really identifying the couples for which that's possible.
Yeah.
And I found it really interesting what you were saying earlier about having sat in on the Marek, and it being maybe of those Marek clients, a really small proportion of clients that would have been appropriate. But certainly at Oasis, that's been something that we've been able to do and has really reduced risk. But it's been in some cases, and probably a small number of cases, where we've worked with both partners in order to reduce the risk that's posed. So it's fascinating, and I think you're right, that sort of continuing conversation what we learn and do is great.
The Goldner Project in New York, at the Ackerman, because they were working with a whole range of couples, and they would basically work with the men and the women for a number of weeks until they felt that they were in position to see them as a couple, and then they would go back to individual meetings. So they would mix it up a bit, and I certainly am not against that as a model as well. I don't think that I'm not completely hooked on the idea that all the sessions have to be with the couple in the room. But as I said, some people become very suspicious and quite paranoid if that's not set up properly, because they may feel that something's going on behind their back that's threatening their relationship. Yeah.
So we've got some questions from Chloe Elizabeth. So about whether children get offered therapy whilst the parents are offered couples therapy. And then another one about disability and learning disabilities, and whether these are taken into consideration when undertaking couples therapy.
Yeah, no, these are really good questions. So the Harrow project, we were trying to test the model, the mentalization-based approach with couples where one of the partners or both of the partners had a learning disability, and we couldn't actually reach them. So we would certainly take into account any kind of disability, the nature of the disability, and in what ways it might limit capacity for consent or equal engagement. And we would certainly think very carefully, because that in itself becomes a sort of power differential in couples, in some couples anyway. So we would. What was the other part of that question?
So there's learning disabilities, and then whether the children were also receiving.
Thank you. So we haven't, because we don't do direct work with children at Tavistock Relationships, we haven't been too involved with, we've been concerned about them, but we haven't been directly involved with them. But we're running a project at the minute called Child in Need, and this is to support children in relation to parental conflict, and it comes under the Reducing Parental Conflict agenda. And we basically commissioned a youth Fitzrovia Youth in Action, which is in Camden, to work. So they're offering peer mentoring for the children of the couples we're seeing, and that's completely separate. So the parents agree to the children being put forward for that program, and the children then, that the organization brings the children into their organization and supports them, and they're evaluating their side of it, and we're evaluating the couple work. And from my meetings with the parents that I've seen, the kids are loving it. They're feeling really supported. They don't feel on their own. They're with other kids where the parents are arguing and fighting, and so and also you hope that through the intervention the conflict lessens, and then the children are happier anyway. So we're working in tandem, if you like, with these two bits. Yeah.
Oh, that's
and
really
I like that model. I like that model.
So a question from Karen. So in your experience, do you think as much care is taken in assessing risk and safety and assessing for appropriateness for treatment in CAMS setting where the child is identified as IP, but still returning to context or experiencing domestic abuse?
Oh God, I have a big, long relationship with CAMS because I worked there for many, many years and I supervise. I think there's a real dilemma here because I think CAMS is inundated with referrals of children and young people, and they still do the same comprehensive assessment as they've always done, and the clinicians are pretty hot on picking up the risks. So they do the same sort of risk assessments as we all do. They might take longer perhaps to refer out. I doubt very much that they would be working with couples where there's abuse, and more likely to be referring them either to Tavistock Relationships because they know the programs operate there, or to the local domestic abuse services. And certainly when I worked in CAMS, I referred a number of people to the local services because I could see that I couldn't work with them as couples, and certainly not in CAMS because they don't have a contract to work with couples anyway. They have a contract to work with the parents. And there's a bit of slippage between parental work and couple work, but they should really be responding in the same way that we all are expected to respond. They have the same safeguarding responsibilities.
And just a question from Libby, but also from me. What do we mean by IP?
IP as in,
the child is identified as IP.
Oh, sorry, identified patient.
There we go.
or index patient. When did that come up? Was that in
was in the question, and I just read it out like I knew what I was saying. I had no idea. So I should have added that as a question as well. I realise we're about 10 minutes over. Are we okay for another 5 minutes, Damian?
I'm fine. Yeah, I'm happy to go on.
Got so many questions that are coming in, and we're getting into some lengthy ones. But we'll do another 5 minutes, not questions, probably. So the equating of super nanny and the small children reacting is really thought-provoking. How transparent are you with the techniques you're using with the couples?
I am. I'm very. I say to them because the thing with me is I'm too friendly and I'm too kind of out there, and I'm too. But I'm also quite tough, and so I will be saying to them, look, I'm going to be interrupting you today. I'm going to be stopping you from doing stuff if you get into big fights, because that's not going to be helpful to us being able to work together. And they can't help themselves. And then I'll just say, do you remember I said, this is why I'm going to do this? So I in those moments, I think people regress. They get into blind states of rage and they lose their minds a bit, and they start sort of swearing and shouting and threatening. I've had people leave the room, bang the door, and you don't know if they're coming back or what. So yeah, I mean, I would just be very out there with them. And I'm also I would say to couples, look, I really am concerned about what I'm seeing in front of me at the minute. I'm not sure that we can work safely together here. I know you want to come and work, but this is not safe. So what do you guys want to do about this?
Mm-hmm.
Because then if we want a contract, what are the conditions around this?
And I think that leads on really nicely to Sharon's question, which about how can we determine what is low risk when things can escalate very quickly.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I don't think anything's ever low risk in this area. I think we just have to assume it's not as high as some of the risks that we were talking about with some of the other cases. Michael Johnson talked about antisocial and psychopathic type behaviors in perpetrators. And I think it's very rare that those kinds of personalities would come to therapy just by the way that they're set up. They'd be far too paranoid, far too suspicious. They would be too controlling from the minute they get in there.
So the very fact that they're self-referring is a good sign.
Yeah, well, yeah. And so the low risk would be something I feel I can manage in the room and can speak to and have already checked out that it's not getting any worse than this when they're away from the session, or that anything worse than this has happened before. Because you get couples who come and it looks like sweetness and light, and then the police have been out the night before. So as long as we know what we're talking about, then, but if they start to sort of disclose more and more, and it becomes clear that the risk is not low, then we would take action.
So one from John Christian. So attachment theory is an important part of parental abuse within cases of parental alienation. It also seems to be used to use a lot of coercion and control, both to the child and to the targeted parent. The abuser more often than than the mother in these cases uses coercion of the child to control the targeted parent to effectively accuse the targeted parents. So what are your thoughts on the complex coercion and control dynamics within parental alienation cases? And how do they relate to attachment theory? So just a small one, Damian.
Well, how they might relate to attachment theory is that you've got essentially a partner or a couple relationship where the individual who's alienating has had some sort of alienation themselves, usually, and basically they use this as a weapon. So there is one couple that come to mind where the father, for example, whose own father left when he was young, and has left his wife. He was so organized by the insecurity, by the loss, the abandonment, that in no way was he prepared to allow his wife any access to the child. So he went for complete custody, which he didn't get, and then proceeded to basically almost kidnap the child. I mean, this was many years ago, and yeah, so of course it's linked to attachment behavior, in the sense that what we carry then gets activated by the separation or the loss of the child for the parent, because it's then as if it's happening again, and this time they're not going to lose. So it becomes like a crusade.
So I think probably the question we'll leave it on is Laura's question. So in couple therapeutic intervention, is it okay to apply these two models, cognitive behavioural therapy model and solution focus models, to enable clarity of ego states, so parent, adult and child analysis that could be patterns of family background, before getting into helping them find solution grounds?
Yeah, I mean, these are different ways of describing, in my terms, very similar things. So I'm aware of the solution focused model. We probably wouldn't, I wouldn't necessarily use a pure model, a pure cognitive behavioral approach, nor a pure solution-focused model, but I would use elements of these different models. So I'm much more eclectic, and even though I'm trained systemically and psychoanalytically, so I would tend to, whatever the client or the patient needs, I would then pull these out of my repertoire and work within the parameters of these different approaches. So the TA model of the parent, adult, child is very much in my mind, as is the life cycle model as well, in terms of transitions and the stress and the idea of people regressing under particular conditions or triggers. I mean, the other thing we haven't mentioned today, but we're right in the area of trauma. A lot of people who come for help, even though it might be a couple relationship or it might be some abusive behavior, it's often rooted in some sort of trauma of one sort or another, which might be an attachment trauma.
Well, thank you so much for staying with us for another 15 minutes.
No way, that's fine.
It's been really wonderful. I really enjoyed that, learned an awful lot. And I think that's probably something that we're all going to go away and be thinking about this afternoon. There is going to be a recording of this webinar made available to you shortly. And if you have enjoyed this event, and I'm absolutely certain that you will have done, there is still time to register for the next couple of upcoming events. So we've got challenging perpetrator behaviour tomorrow morning and an introduction to Phoenix tomorrow afternoon. And then I think we've got challenging police decisions and then our wonderful closing event on Thursday. So we'd love to see you there, and you can go to DA Everybody's Business to register for those. We can also keep the conversation going. So with the hashtag DA Everybody's Business and No C Speak Out. And if the talk today has raised anything for you personally and you'd like to find out more about services that are available, you can head to the website that was on the pop-up earlier, domesticabuseservices.org.uk, to find out where your local services are and what they can offer for you. And it's just popped up there again as well.